Okay, hi everyone. I hope everyone is with us today. So thank you for joining. My name is Elizabeth Marino, and I'm an anthropologist who has worked for a long time in rural Alaska, thinking about repetitive flooding and the options available to communities in rural Alaska that have experienced repetitive flooding. I want to especially thank our panelists and audience members who are joining from Alaska. We're at 6:30 in the morning. Also, I just want to note that the panelist that we have today, Weyiouanna from Alaska, is having some problems with internet, which also just speaks to, I think, some of the topics that we're going to talk about in this session, which are just and equity adaptation strategies and how those can be derailed by really simple things like having easy access to the internet. So it's my honor today to be sitting on this panel with Annie Weyiouanna, Patty Ferguson-Bonhee, Alessandra Geralaman, Chantel Cormadell, Nathan Jesse, and Simon Manda. Our session this morning is dedicated to discussing repetitive flooding, adaptation, and climate change-driven relocation in the context of tribes and indigenous communities, particularly in Alaska and Louisiana. You know, though we are mostly concerned with the communities in which we live or with whom we work, we do believe that insights from these contexts have broader applicability. And some of us on this panel have worked together for many, many years, and others of us have just begun working together more recently. But when we began talking about this panel, we came up with this idea or this concept of contradiction, which we'll see in the title of our panel, Climate Change, Displacement, Colonialism, and Contradiction. We felt that, you know, especially in the context of tribal communities who are negotiating just and equitable adaptation, that there are these contradictions that arise, by which we really mean these structural obstacles that need to be acknowledged. So for example, on one hand, many community members, community activists, and place-based researchers from Louisiana and Alaska have advocated for decades, right, for increased attention to climate change impacts. But on the other hand, when that attention arrives, sometimes those very advocates had their own work displaced by more powerful institutional interests. Another contradiction might be that as more and more scientists and policymakers realize the wealth of observation and insight that Indigenous scientists and knowledge holders have, that it remains challenging to do things like move National Science Foundation money and overhead into small tribal entities, meaning that even though there's this increased interest in these knowledge sets, that those interests can remain exploitative. But for climate change-driven relocation or managed retreat, I really felt like there were two key contradictions. The first is that on the one hand, sea level rise and climate change related flooding is an urgent issue that needs and demands immediate action. We see this in frontline communities. We'll probably hear about that today, that there are really devastating impacts from these repetitive floods. You know, I mostly do research in Alaska, but the irony is that my mother has lived in a trailer outside of her house for the better part of this last year because she was displaced from her home by the two devastating earthquakes that hit my hometown of Lake Charles, Louisiana. And, you know, we know hurricane season is just starting up again. So I know personally, and everyone here knows, right, that the urgency is real. Yet on the other hand, we can predict that when institutions act urgently and are under pressure, that bias, racism, and colonial impulses are likely to be part of that action. There's clear empirical evidence that acting urgently or panicking, if you will, is going to predictably replicate the structural, deeply rooted governance issues that created inequitable risk in the first place. And this is a real problem that should give us pause. So the second contradiction, I believe, is this. Colonial histories are very clear in the extent to which top-down, centrally managed, social engineering of tribal communities, which throughout history have so often been justified on behalf of the public good or for people's own best interests, that these projects have had devastating impacts for tribal communities and many other communities as well. And yet it is often through these same federal institutions that we talk about managing retreat. So the contradiction is that, is it even possible to locate a just and equitable solution to repetitive flooding through these institutions? And even if we create a new institution, is it possible to break away from the structural assumptions that can sometimes seem to be baked in? You know, it's not going to be easy to locate and correct for the assumptions that exist in policy and the law that further entrench the inequitable distribution of flooding or the inequitable distribution of interventions. But this is really a goal of our work, to understand the complex experiences of communities on the ground and to locate and point out possible corrections to the structural assumptions that underpin policies. And hopefully that will lead us to more fair and more fair solutions. So this panel will begin with stories from our colleagues from Alaska and Louisiana, if we can get the call-in function working on the Zoom call, that are sharing their own expertise with us concerning their own communities. We'll follow that with much briefer presentations by myself and my colleagues Nathan, Alessandra, and Simon, who will discuss what we will call these unavoidable points, or those crucible places or crucible assumptions within policy and the law that must change in order for just and equitable adaptation to be possible. Thank you all again for being here. And I think Patty, we'd like to ask you to present first.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. All right. So I'm Patty Ferguson Bonney. Thank you for being here. I'm from the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe, and I teach at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. I'm here today to talk about my community, Pointe-au-Chien, which is located in the southernmost part of Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes in South Louisiana, the issues that we're facing, and how we're trying to adapt despite challenges to that adaptation process. So I want to share with you a picture. This is a picture of Pointe-au-Chien from the 1930s. And as you can see, the houses are on the ground. People in Pointe-au-Chien were self-sustaining. They had everything that they needed: food, water, medicine, materials to make homes. And I want you to note that the houses are on the ground. So this is a palmetto house. My mom lived in one of these houses. She was born in the late 1940s. So I think that's just really important to point out that at this time, the land was very lush and fertile, and that the Mississippi River topsoil replenished the earth, created new land. We had barrier islands that provided protection from storms. And we were really able to be a self-determined and self-sustaining community. Now, this is a map of the land loss from the 1930s to 2010. There was in the early 1900s, the Mississippi River levee system went into effect, and you can see those places that are levied. Those places do not have the same amount of land loss, if you can see over on the right, but there was a decision made about who was important and who should be protected through these levee systems. There's also the discovery of oil and gas, and then we have the loss of the barrier islands, which causes coastal erosion, but you can see the great loss. So what I want to do now is just share a video about Pointe-au-Chien to kind of give you some context of our community.
My name is Donald Dardar, and I'm from Pointe-au-Chien. I guess it's in the blood because my dad did it, his dad before him did it. And I guess their dad before them, they just followed the tradition. Yeah, when it first started, we didn't have no license back then, we just went crabbing. But it was a line, you'd set a beat, I guess every 6 foot on the line, and you'd have a little hand net, and the line would just follow the side of the boat, and you just pick the crabs, catch them. A lot more water now than what we had when I was growing up. We had so many trees behind my house or whatever. I could get lost in the trees. But now it's a lot different because we used to have islands that's all gone now. Years back, you had a lot more protection.
So I guess the reason why we got together is because last week the government finally issued new rules on the federal recognition process. of the changes that people wanted were not made, but there are significant differences, I think, that will help our petition.
They say in 50 years this is completely gone, so. And I could believe them, because if they don't do nothing on the outside or on the islands to try and build it with some kind of protection, it's going to go. It's going to wash away. For me, it's the best place for me to live anyway. I don't know if anybody else feels that way, but my house is right across the street, and I walk right to the bayou side to get in my boat and go to work. I don't think somebody could ask for anything better than that. Our community may be like a mile and a half long. On the other side of the bayou, it's all Native American people and American Indians.
That's a big crab right there, huh?
If you ask who Donald Dardar is, at the last house on this end or the first house on this end, you know who he is. I know everybody that lives down the road. So we're all family, everybody's family.
So I thought it would be helpful to show that video just to put Pointe-au-Chien in context and why it's so important to us, and to demonstrate how value judgments have been made about what's important have had a negative impact on our tribal community because we haven't been part of those decision-making processes. So there have been value judgments on which communities are important to protect. There are value judgments on how the land should be used. Value judgments on when we finally engage in coastal restoration in Louisiana as to which communities should be included in that. And for us, our identity, culture, our way of life is all tied to this place and our identity, because Pointe-au-Chien is our historic tribal homelands. We have sacred sites, cemeteries, fishing villages. We lived at least 6 to 9 miles further down the bayou, so we've already been displaced because the historic villages where we lived before, a lot of them no longer exist because of erosion and land loss. People have had to move because of saltwater intrusion, that you can't grow crops, different things like that. So, you know, we're already a community that's displaced, but we, you know, are connected to the land and the place where we are. And we think it's really important to maintain our community, our culture, and way of life. And that's why we're advocating so hard for adaptation and to maintain some part of our community. We know that you may not know, but we're not federally recognized, neither is Ile Jean-Charles. Chantel's going to be presenting, and we believe that the main barrier in exercising our self-determination, protecting our land, maintaining our cultural heritage is the lack of federal recognition, and not having federal recognition throughout the years, because then a lot of the decision makers are ignoring the needs of the tribal communities. So this is a picture of Pointe-au-Chien, the village where people currently live. And it's the area of, you know, what we're trying to protect and maintain through levee systems, locks, but the area below, with the 6 to 9 miles further down, and all this huge area below in the Terrebonne Basin, like, we really do still want to have measures to protect that area because it's important to us as a people. And we, you know, after the BP oil spill, there were some preliminary scoping projects, and we put in some requests for some oyster projects to shore up our area. And I remember going to this meeting, and someone from the state said, well, the science doesn't support projects in your area. So that really, you know, was unfortunate, because there were projects that were used with that BP scoping money, Deepwater Horizon scoping money, and they were put on the west and the east but the communities in our area of Pointe-au-Chien, Ilde Charles, that whole area was exposed and nothing was done to try to, prevent any more land loss. So we've engaged in some projects to try to work towards adaptation. And so one of them that we've done, which I think is really important, is working with Sea Grant on using our traditional ecological knowledge with Western science to show what areas are sustainable and resilient so we can advocate for projects. For those of you who know, in Louisiana, even though you want a project, if you're not part of the master plan, then federal funding can't be allocated to that. So initially, the master plan in Louisiana didn't take into account the cultural heritage of the tribes, what was important to tribal communities. And even now, there are just some minimal projects. And so we've been advocating and fighting for things to be included. So hopefully we'll be able to use this traditional ecological knowledge that's been merged with Western science to advocate for some projects that will be supported. In the meantime, we have been elevating our homes. We've actually been elevating our tribal building. We have a medicinal garden that was almost done, but to maintain our traditional plants. We have a community garden that's outside the community. We have a bulkhead safe harbor project for fishermen to tie their boats because we're primarily a fishing community. We've done these oyster stabilization project to protect some mounds that have been impacted by the land loss and the oil canal cuts. We are included, our community, unlike Ilde Charles, is going to be included in a floodgate, or we are included in a floodgate, and we will be included in the levee system. But like I said, the area below us won't be included, which will, expose us to some danger, continue to expose us to some danger. And until that's completed in 2023, we have some temporary measures in place that we've had to advocate for after we were again flooded for Hurricane Barry. So we have been actively advocating for projects to protect our community because we know that we're important, which leads me to, something that's happened more recently that I think is important that fits into this discussion of colonialism and displacement. In Pointe-au-Chien, the Ilde Charles is right next to us, but Native Americans in our area weren't allowed to go to high school until the late 1960s because of policies that Terrebonne Parish had in place. Actually, the chief of Ilde Charles was part of a lawsuit when he was a student that led to the integration of the schools. And so once there was integration, there was a lot of racism. Our tribal people were spit on, called names. So we have quite a few elders or people not quite elders who don't have a high school education because of this discrimination. About a decade or so ago, they closed the library in our community. And the school is still there, which is very important because it's a place of cohesion and stability for the students. We have been advocating for an immersion language program in our school for several years under Louisiana law, and the superintendent and the school board have not moved on those petitions. It's an important thing to note about the school that our kids attend in Pointe-au-Chien. It's about 70% Native American, primarily for kids from Pointe-au-Chien and Ilde Charles. In creating the Morganza to the Gulf Levee project, it was noted that community stability and cohesion are bolstered by libraries, schools, and places of worship. And the last segment of the Morganza is to go in effect in 2023. Well, last year, the Terrebonne Parish School District's risk manager recognized the importance of schools to community stability and noted that generations of families pass through a school's halls in Terrebonne Parish, and they don't just serve to educate students. They're often the only community center, and the population effects cut both ways. He said, it's almost like a death spiral. Once you lose your school, you lose your population as well. Well, in 2019, the community was assured that there was no way that the Pointe-au-Chien school would be closed because we had heard rumors. And at the end of this last school year, the school board voted to close the school without consulting with the tribe or the tribal parents, and with disregard to how this will impact the tribes and the communities. And at the same time, they've invested multi-million dollars in other schools that are not primarily Native American. And just to note, this is the largest ratio of Native American students for any school in the state of Louisiana. And we're really concerned about the closure of this school and what's it going to do to the lifeblood of our community. And I think it also tells us that we have some current graduates who came back to Pointe-au-Chien for their graduation, kids who went to Pointe-au-Chien Elementary, about, that this shows to them that we don't matter. We're not part of the fabric of the community, that our voice doesn't matter, and that, there's been an analysis done that we're not important. So I think that's really unfortunate. And I think that this is one of the risk of decision makers not taking into account all of what they do on the impact of the community and our future survival. So thank you for allowing me to share. I'm going to turn this back over to Beth.
Thanks, Patty. We have a question that came in, and I don't know if you want to go ahead and take it right now, but the question is, could Patty share what the person might have meant that the science didn't support adaptation in your community?
Yeah, at this point, this was after the BP oil spill. So there were decisions made about, should, we have coastal restoration projects in certain areas, and, based on where they thought projects would be sustainable, I think is how they decided that. I'm not really sure. I couldn't tell you how they decided that. They just said the science doesn't support it. And we were told that plainly, pretty clearly. And so that's why we were really saying, well, have you really looked? Does the science really not support it? Or is it just something you don't want to invest in? And is it a community that you don't want to invest in? And I think doing this work with Sea Grant, looking at our traditional ecological knowledge, knowing where things can be shored up, and actually using some of these oil spill banks that were created to our detriment, we can now use, like they're higher, so we can use them to try to support some areas in our community and some sacred sites and mounds and cemeteries that are in those areas. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think those are decisions that were made by people who have, science degrees or work in this area, but without the input of tribal communities.
Thanks for that explanation. That presentation was really powerful. We're going to try to get Annie on the line now and see how this goes. Annie, can you hear us, and can you see if your audio is working?
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, good morning. Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning. Sorry my internet is not working. We've been dealing with rain and thunder that disturbed the internet yesterday as well, when I was trying to do a trial run. But good morning. My name is Weyiouanna. I am from Shishmaref, Alaska. It is a pet village, 125 northwest of Nome. So we live in northwest Alaska, and we are one of the villages of many on the coast that deal with erosion. And so we are 95% Inupiaq, and we live a subsistence lifestyle, and we live off the land, the sea, and the air. And so majority of our food comes from the sea, along with the land and the air, meaning the ducks. But we are being affected by erosion as well, but also climate change because like right now is our spring hunting time, and it's the biggest hunt for the rest of the year for us. We lost the seals and the walrus, and that's our staple food for the whole entire year. So, and normally our ice, we have like really good sea ice. The ocean freezes during in the fall, starting in the fall, in September, all the way through May. And so it's like the ocean is solid and it's ice, and it depends on how the ice is and how things go. I know it's kind of hard to explain and talk about on the phone, but I wish I had visuals. And so the ice is important to us as well, because that leads the seals and the walrus. And like I said earlier, that's our staple food for the year. And because this year, this is one of the years that we've had really bad ice, to where it's harder for us to subsist and live off the sea. So a lot of the things that we do is subsistence. And when we can't get any seals or walrus or mammals, from the sea, that makes it hard for us. And we are impacted by climate change because the ice isn't as strong as it used to be, maybe like 5-10 years ago. It's kind of more dangerous now for us because it's thinner and people can fall in and drown. We actually just had a tragedy due to bad ice, like first part of this month, and also that goes along with I experienced tragedy in my found, and he went through bad ice, and he was going duck hunting, and he was coming home, and he fell through ice and drowned. And like I said, that was like maybe 10 years ago, and even so, the ice is not. It's not as thick as it used to be, and our erosion, our fall storms are coming earlier now, and that is causing erosion on our ocean side. We are an island that is impacted through the ocean side and the lagoon side. We have mainland that's 7 miles up, but we have a lagoon, and we also experience spring storms, like we call them silent storms, because that causes the water from the lagoon to flood. So not only being impacted by erosion, it's also flooding, and our island is not like it used to be. I've seen it change within my lifetime, and I am not that old. And within just, I want to say 10 years, 15 years, I've seen so much change to where I can't even explain to my kids. I have 3 kids, and to explain and to talk to them about how our island has changed and how like we've been I've actually heard about media saying just move them to the nearest hub, move them to the nearest town, the nearest biggest town, which would be no more Kotzebue. And we're like, we can't do that because that takes away our identity. And as Patty explained earlier in her presentation, identity is important. It is who you are. It is who, where you come from. And you can't take that away because, you know, we are Inupiat people that live off the land, sea and air. And so you can't, you know, tell us to move, or you can't tell us to just uproot our roots. That's like telling another person, you know, questioning who they are. And to be questioning who you are is kind of sad because, you know, that makes you think about where you come from and you know, what's important to you. So I'm always saying that's like a punch in the gut to be questioned who you are and having to explain what you do, because it shouldn't be a question. It should, you know, just, but we are, like I said, we have experienced erosion, and because of that, we've had to move 18 houses from one side of the island to the other, and we didn't have people to come in and say this is how it's done, this is how you do it. We kind of are self-sufficient, and we have, you know, we take care of each other. We are a tight-knit community that takes care of each other and makes sure everybody supports each other. Recently, here's an example of that. Recently, our community just were impacted with 3 deaths in one of them being the tragic accident, and then the other ones were just like natural causes. So we had to have 3 funerals in a week, and that's kind of heartbreaking for us. And we're still trying to cope and get deal with it again, because we support each other. We come together and we help each other, and we talk about, I mean, not talk, but we like fundraise, and we just comfort each other. So and I think a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in nowadays is money. Everybody expects us just to get up and move, and we can't, because, you know, we can't just move because there's no funding. And because of that, you know, that's why a lot of people tell us, like through the media and through ways like getting our stories and running with it, instead of having to hear what our story is and use it to where we are heard as a voice, instead of it just, you know, being an item of, yeah, they're just a coastal erosion community that's dealing with the erosion. But it's kind of frustrating when you have to hear people say just move them to a hub when it shouldn't be, because that's questioning who you are. I mean, I would not question who you are as a person, because it's not right. It's not right for them to say who are you and where you come from. That's taken away your identity, and having identity in America nowadays. I mean, like shipping, here's an example. Shipping to Alaska is crazy, and some things you can't even get shipped here. And because of that, you know, I've had to argue with Amazon a lot of times, and say we're just as American as you are. We shouldn't be discriminated. We shouldn't be people that, you know, you can't ship to. So Patty brought up good points about identity, and I think that's super important because we are working to try to move to the mainland, and but there's a lot of hurdles that we've had to go through, and a lot of things that we've had to go through to try to get to where we are now.
Thanks, Annie. Are you ready for me to move on to Chantal?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So thank you so much, and thank you for putting up with calling in. That was a really important thing for us to hear. So we're going to move now to Chantal Cormedel, and she's going to talk to us about Ile de Jean Charles.
Thank you, Beth. Can y'all hear me okay? So I am Chantal from Ile de Jean Charles. I am the tribal secretary. I was born and I lived on the island until I was about 4 or 5-ish, and a storm came and flooded our trailer, and we had to move. It was interesting because I was listening to Annie, and I was looking at the picture that y'all see. That's the bayou that was man-made, dug between the island. And I was just listening to her say that she can't even explain to her 3 kids what the changes were. And I just remembered a story. We were crossing the bridge to get to my grandmother's over this waterway, and I was telling my kids, I also have 3 kids, about how we used to fish and crab in this bayou. And my grandpa used to bring his big shrimping boat into this bayou that you see that is completely overgrown, because it now has we have a ring levee around the island now that cuts off the flow of the water to this bayou. It's now in essentially a drainage ditch. So it was just interesting to see how the difference, I am 39, and the difference, that little bit of time span from when I was a little girl till now, my kids can't even fathom and comprehend. That's the amount of change we've experienced in our community. And it's just so profound to think about when you sit down and think about it. Instead of listening to Anne talk about it, it really just allowed me to think about that. But that was one, y'all. So we are here to talk about our resettlement. And so our community, we have adapted like the Pointe-au-Chien community. We are right next to them geographically. Our ancestors were not originally in this area. They were further down, like the Pointe-au-Chien. As the storms came and eroded those areas, we've constantly moved up the bayou and settled on this land that was higher. It was originally a ridge. And we have adapted. We have homes that are raised. We are now to the point where we have to answer that question of resettlement and relocation. And that'll bring me to our process. So we've worked for a little bit over 2 decades now as a community to figure out what's our best way to resettle, because our community is different from any other community in the world. So what works for our community may not necessarily work for others. So we've dived into this process, and it was completely driven by the community members. You're seeing some pictures of some workshops we've done with our community members and some folks that are on this call, some partners that we've worked with, Mass Design, Lowlander Center, allowed us, the National Endowment for the Arts, to come in and sit down with our tribal members and look and see what is actually going on, and what from our knowledge can we take and say, this worked for our community, this did not. These are some things we want to make sure to safeguard our cultures and our ideas and our life ways, that we want to make sure that these things do pass to the next generation and continue going. So, because at the end of the day, it is all about making sure your community and your ideas and life ways and culture transfer to the next generation so they can live and enjoy the same benefits that you have in their community, and feel like they belong to somewheres, and know that they do have that identity as a tribal member and as a tribal community, to know that they have ancestors, that they have continued that generation and generation on of skills and artistry and life ways. So we really took that community driven process to heart. And our chief said in 2002, this is a quote he gave to the paper: "The island community is dying. We talk on how we want to keep our heritage and culture, but unless we can do something to keep our community together, it is gone for gone." That's his coin term. We have to look at the alternate plan to keep the community alive. I hate to say this, but maybe relocation is the alternative with the right offer. And that is so true. If we do nothing, then we can just say it's gone. Just like the space of land, like Pointe-au-Chien, the area that's below the levee system, if we do nothing, that area is gone. If we do nothing in the US to stand up and do something, it's all lost. And we have to, as communities that are dealing with this, as policymakers, as leaders in science, we all have to come together and look at these situations and say, okay, how can we do this in the most just and right way? And there is not a cookie cutter plan for anybody, but it's getting in these communities and listening to what works for them and see how we can help them. So when we sat down as tribal leaders, we looked at our people and the movement of our people from the early 1970s, mid 1970s to present. And we developed this chart that you see. All these purple dots are our community members. And they've all originated on the island, which is at the bottom, the big little purple line at the bottom. And we looked at movement, and realistically, the movement is not far from their original places. So we developed the idea that, so our folks did not want to change the way they live. They just moved because realistically they could not handle homes being flooded every year by a storm, or some, like this past storm year, 4 different times we've had flooding of the island or around the island because of storms. That is just not feasible to keep a community alive and thriving. So we looked at this, and that's whenever we decided, okay, relocation is necessary because our people were doing it on their own anyway. And how do we keep the cohesion of the community together? and that is to move together as a community. And that's where the idea of petitioning for resettlement as a community started. And when, like Patty said earlier, the master plan, if you're not in the master plan, it's not getting done. Science, they did not want to fund the island being included in the levy system because the cost to benefit ratio wasn't high enough. So basically, our community wasn't worth the money investing to save it, but we're worth the money to invest in to move it, which is actually, because that's a 20-year difference, the cost has almost tripled to move the community versus just to build a levee around it. But during this time of relocating our community, we've realized that it is almost impossible to do that with the state and federal funding, because they have this cookie cutter policy, and they have not bend and moved because we are not federally recognized. There were some constraints and some things, and basically they took the cultural context out of our resettlement, where they changed the state's. Our language was, we had powwow grounds, we had a community culture center, and those things in the resettlement turned to festival grounds and a recreation center. Our museum turned into an exhibit space in the recreation center. So there were some very key things that changed as the process went up in that resettlement. So we began a movement called Preserving Our Place. You know, like the chief said in his earlier comment, if we don't do something, it's gone. So we have started this movement of community voice and making sure the community's voice is heard above anything else. So we are doing community interviews. We are documenting all of our culture. We're doing things similar to Pointe-au-Chien, those adaptation projects that they're doing for the community, we're doing for our culture and our safeguarding our place, our identity for our future generations. So what you're looking at is our website for Preserving Our Place. We have a new exhibit that we've been working with Shishmaref to, because even though we're worlds apart, the things that we're going through, and just like Pointe-au-Chien, these communities are going through the same things, basic things at the same time, yet we're all on different levels of having to move, things that we can do in our community, but yet that path is all the same. We're all dealing with the same climate change issues and cultural issues. So we've got together and with Shishmaref, and we're doing a photo exhibit on the beauty and the survival of our community, because even though our communities are ravaged by the climate and flooding and erosion, we still have so much beauty and so much culture that we want to preserve and share with the world. Because if the world doesn't see what's being lost and what the price of that being lost is, why do they even want to take a moment to say, let's think about the policy that's going on? What are we doing that is making things so difficult? So if we bring voice to that and show the world what's going on and how we can really make a difference, then they don't know. And so you have to give people something to look at. So that's what we're trying to do, is do that. And we're also, we have developed a field guide with several of our community partners. We've worked with Mass Design, Lowlander Center, Sustainable Native Communities. This was funded through the National Academy of Science. It's a field guide for communities who are dealing with similar issues and wanting to, and grappling with the idea of, do we stay, do we retreat, do we adapt our buildings and our space, our community to withstand what's coming? And this is just a field guide that we developed that allows the community's voice to be heard in these situations, and making sure that those who come and work with communities do listen to the community's voices, because that is one of the most important things that we found through this process, that if the community isn't involved and it's not the community's ideas and culture, that it just becomes just the next town over. It's not, you're not pulling any of that culture, any of that identity. The new resettlement that the state is venturing to do right now is just, like Ann said, just being moved to the next town, because there's not a a cultural context to it. It is just another subdivision. It is just another development, and we can't do that. And it's not just Native cultures; it's all across all communities, that we have to understand that those communities have their own footprint. And if we don't take their footprint and move them to another place, then we're leaving that footprint behind, and we're leaving all their identity behind. And that's not the best practice to do. Our government has been doing that for years. In 1830, the Mississippi Choctaws signed a treaty called Dancing Rabbit Creek. And when you look at the policy in Dancing Rabbit Creek, it's amazing to see the similarities. They had to live on their land 5 years that they already owned in order to stay there and become a U.S. citizen. Our resettlement, you have to live there 5 years in order for that to become your free home and free land that you've already signed for. So our country does know how to move people. We just don't know how to do it culturally correct or justly.
Thank you so much, Chantal. And we have a question from the audience that I'm going to ask, and then you can feel free to answer it. And then I think Annie wants to answer it as well. But the question is, how can Native peoples practicing subsistence be compensated for the loss of plants and animals upon which they depend?
I don't know how you can compensate for that. We have lost so many traditional plants that we're trying to bring back now. I think it would take a very conscious effort to think of how you can take and move those things, like Pointe-au-Chien did. They have a community garden they've redone in another area. I think possibly thinking outside the box and not just in a normal policy way can possibly be ways you can do that.
Thanks. Annie, do you want to comment too?
Yeah, good morning. I don't think we practice subsistence, we do it. That's kind of like asking, how do you get your chicken? How do you get your beef? Because subsistence is, we as living off the land, air and sea, that means, where do you get your chicken and beef from? Where do you get your food, where you get it from? And if it's lost, it can't be compensated. It's not something that you can just give us money to and to get it back. I mean, like Chantal said, we have to find ways to try to like regrow it, or that's what I feel like. I mean, that it's kind of I feel like a weird question, but yeah, that's kind of in perspective. That's asking, how do you get your chicken? How do you get your beef? How do you get your lettuce? How do you get your carrots? And we have traditional ways that we use to get our native foods. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some shorter presentations that hopefully we can wrap up quickly, so we have time for questions at the end as well. We'll see how that goes. But Nathan, do you want to, I'll invite you to share your screen and talk now.
Yeah, thank you. Let me get the, oops, PowerPoint shared here. All right. So yeah, thanks for having me here in this conversation on colonialism and contradiction, managed retreat. My work focused on community resettlement has consisted of 5 years of ethnographic and collaborative research with Ile-de-Jean-Charles, Biloxi-Chitimacha-Choctaw tribal leaders, as their longstanding efforts to resettle garnered international media attention and government support. And so here are some photos of the tribal-driven planning process that I've taken. And in my collaboration, I've really come to view managed retreat as a form of what Dinah Helio-Whitaker refers to as decontextualization. In As Long as Grass Grows, Helio-Whitaker wrote, quote, "Inquiries that ignore histories characterized by domination and oppression also ignore factors that shape perceptions of justice." In the book, Helio-Whitaker is talking about erasure within the law, but I think it can be extended to settler policy and policy formation as well. And I want to point to three expressions of colonial decontextualization that I've observed operating within these conversations about managed retreat. So conceptually, academics have tended to use the term to collapse really diverse social contexts, power relations, frameworks for mobility and migration, and constructions of disaster. Many scholars point to sort of managing natural hazard risk and the abandonment of land as what Hino and co-authors in 2017 referred to as defining features of managed retreat. But these defining features distort the Ile-de-Jean-Charles resettlement, in part because the conditions that have engendered the resettlement aren't natural. As Patty described, it's colonial, it's river development, land grabs, oil and gas extraction. And then also the ideas for resettlement are not equivalent to abandonment. It's preserving our place, right? As Chantal just described. And so then the other kind of two forms of decontextualization that I wanted to just touch on were programmatic. And so as Chantal described, in 2014, Louisiana's Office of Community Development partnered with tribal leaders and their existing partners at the Lowlander Center, a nonprofit in the area, to apply for federal funds through the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And since 2016, when those funds were awarded to the state to advance the tribe's community resettlement, the state agency has really decontextualized the administration of those funds from the existing tribal-driven struggle for resettlement that led to those funds in the first place. And I think this image is just a potent sort of symbol of decontextualization. So it's a timeline of planning activities that was on the state's website for the Ile-de-Jean-Charles resettlement for like 3 years. And the timeline starts June 16th, 2016, which is 5 months after the award was announced. And so, you know, there's nothing in those 5 months, but then there's also no reference to all of the tribe's contributions to the successful application for federal funds. And then of course, there's no reference also to the 20 years of planning and organizing for community resettlement that was tribal driven before the NDRC program. And so then also there's a kind of decontextualization programmatically of resettlement and buyouts from regional development. And so take Terrebonne Parish, where Ile-de-Jean-Charles is located, for example, approximately 96% of the wetlands are privately held. The largest landowners are ConocoPhillips and Apache Oil. These are the risk producers, and yet they're also afforded coastal futures. Moreover, these industrial actors are seen by the state as partners or stakeholders in adaptation and mitigation work in the Coastal Master Plan that Patty and Chantal both mentioned. Also the Regional Adaptation Strategy and the new Climate Task Force. So all of these sort of main pillars of state responses to the coastal crisis. The state's also pushing new pipelines and gas terminals right next door to restoration projects, which themselves threaten the displacement of indigenous peoples. And then the state accommodates recreational development on the coast and Ile-de-Jean Charles. The destruction of Island Road, for example, was cast as a rationale for funding the resettlement in the state's application for resilience funds. But then after the funding was announced, other state agencies allocated $3 million of BP money to build fishing piers, parking, and a rock levee on the road, which one levee board official characterized as some of the most unstable land of all of coastal Louisiana. And so this brings up this issue of adaptation privilege that Beth has written about. So who has right to place, et cetera. In my work, trying to understand the social encounters produced in part by Managed Retreat, I've been inspired by participatory action research and decolonization. I've strived to, for example, reject the extractive and exploitative research conventions within anthropology, and really been inspired by the work of Linda Tuhiwa Smith, thinking about those issues. I've also sort of tried to recognize tribal leaders' environmental and social knowledges and traditional adaptations as expertise, and of course their rights to steward such expertise. And I think of Dan Wildcat and Kyle White's scholarship, which really examines that. And then finally, I've also tried to find ways to support tribal-driven efforts towards the regeneration of a land base and ecological relations. And I love this article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, by Eve Tuck and Kay Yang. And so I think cultivating a planning praxis that's committed to decolonization remaining accountable to Indigenous-led struggles for justice, and then searching for what's possible despite the constraints of settler law, which is of course the focus of Beth and Alessandra's broader project, is just so urgent in Louisiana. And here's some more images of tribal driven planning. And these designs were produced by the tribe in partnership with Lowlander and some architects, Evan Lynn Leiter, and this was all before the NDRC application or the NDRC funding. So really just thinking we can't look askance from the violence and erasure of colonial and racial capitalist development and still expect to find just or equitable sort of ways of addressing socio-ecological risks. Instead, and I'm really speaking to those who really care about the climate emergency, but also settler professionals that are studying or administering funds for adaptation, have a responsibility to support the self-determination of peoples harmed by ongoing colonial development. And we have a responsibility to support existing tribal-driven assessments of the entire scope of risks, social and environmental, and adaptation plans as they unfold or as they exist. Otherwise, really Managed Retreat is just removal by another name. There's some citations, and thanks for having me as part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Okay, I'm going to try to get my... Okay, so I'm going to try to go quickly, and I'm going to, because we're running out of time, but I just want to make the point that it really seems like one of the themes that's coming out of this session, and one of the things that we want to focus on, is this idea that it's really hard to walk that line and to talk about the really deep-rooted structural critiques of colonialism and inequity and racism, and that are always a part of these conversations, and to make really meaningful structural critiques of those things, and still to address the daily realities on the ground and the policies that need to change in big and small ways to even begin to keep people safe. And like Nathan alluded to, Alessandra and I's project and Annie's project is trying to really think through how you do both of those things at the same time. And that's a real challenge. As my title slide says, I just want to give a shout out. These photos that you're going to see are the work of the Shishmaref artist, Dennis Davis. You can follow him on Instagram. I have his link here. He's a close colleague of ours. Is really an amazing artist and is the partner that Chantal was talking about that's working on this exhibit that will be on the Ile-de-Jean Charles Protect Our Place website, or Preserve Our Place website that's forthcoming. You can also see his work at our project's website, which is, the link is there. So what I'm gonna just move straight to the points that I want to make that are specific policy recommendations, I suppose. And the first one that I want to make is this. I think that one of the reasons planning and funding, and as Annie talked about, funding is such a big deal, that one of the reasons this is that funding full and partial relocations in Alaska may be so difficult is this: paying pre-storm market value for buyouts in neighborhoods or communities that have suffered from habitual or historical or colonial neglect, right? Or in older houses in extremely rural communities such as rural Alaska. It means that the value of the house being bought out is not sufficient to find new, safe, and secure housing. And that has to do with history, right? In some cases, even paying a little over market value, and we know there are incentive structures and some programs to allow for that, but even that is not enough to secure new housing. So, and this has practical application and is a structural critique, right? Because when we think about buyouts, sometimes we think about them as a pathway for funding relocation. We consider that these are mechanisms that allow homeowners to remove their equity from an increasingly at-risk place and put that equity into a new, less risky home. But buyouts will only be successful and equitable if, when they offer, they allow the homeowner to leave an overall more risky situation, which includes those compounded risks that we've heard people talking about today, and enter into an overall less risky situation. And this means reasonably being able to leave a flood-prone area and move to a secure and desirable home or house that is culturally meaningful without taking on additional debt. We think those are some of the categories that need to be met. And for middle or upper class housing, we can imagine that this is easily possible, to take pre-storm market value and invest in a new home that's on higher ground. And it might work that way. But in other communities or in less wealthy communities, this might not be possible. And in Alaska, we know that the buyout program's real market appraisals and offers can be hundreds of thousands of dollars less than what it realistically costs to build a new home in traditional tribal territory in the Arctic and subarctic. And Annie was alluding to that too, the idea that people are pushing communities sometimes or insinuating that they should move to hub communities because that's more economically efficient, right? But the cultural mandate is to stay within traditional tribal territory, but that has these structural issues that make that so challenging. I want to give credit where it's due here, and a lot of these insights come from community advocates, from people like Sally Cox at the state of Alaska, from folks at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, or Joel Niemeyer has also had these insights, and he's talking tomorrow about his work in Akiak. That's a really important presentation. I encourage everyone to attend. But this is a hard one, you know, how to think through policies that reduce risk for people and include a property exchange, but are not completely bound up in market forces. We understand that buyouts often stand in contrast to abandonment, and as such are frequently discussed as the better option, but it's imperative to foreground that what we're trying to do is lower risk to people, not just lower the risk of property damage. That should be the focus of these programs. And back to this original idea of contradiction, you know, one of our hypotheses that we have is that one of the reasons that relocation is in response to climate impacts is so difficult is because of the idea that property is so sacrosanct as a site for conveying rights under US law. So trying to think outside of a property-based disaster response and instead create and focus on a people-based disaster response that includes an understanding of history seems to be very challenging. And theoretically, we could begin to unravel and try to recognize, the notion of property law in the US, and that's fascinating, but it's going to take a while, right? So pragmatically, we can also think about intermediate steps, like considering big incentives that realistically offer adequate, meaningful home replacement and community-based infrastructure replacement to individuals and communities that voluntarily decide to move. And the next 2 points I'm going to make are incredibly basic. This has been part of a conversation in Alaska for at least a decade when we think about obstacles to relocation. But it just keeps being reconfirmed, and maybe academics need to get a little bored sometimes, because if small things like this don't change, then our big theoretical concepts of like the whole new world, right, become meaningless. So the first is that the cost match requirement for most FEMA funding, for example, BRIC, significantly limits the amount of money that rural, poor, and low-income communities can apply for. If these are the programs that increasingly potentially allow relocation to be part of hazard mitigation planning, then relocation potentially becomes out of reach for rural communities that just don't have the tax base from which they can raise matching funds. So if we are talking about equity, we really need to discuss eliminating the cost match requirements for hazard mitigation funds. And the last thing is just, along with this idea, is that the cost of compiling an application for this funding, including engineering and design needs, is also an impediment to access. We know there's technical help to some of the funding programs, but if having a well-formulated and polished application is the gateway for funding, then it is just always going to be the communities, jurisdictions, and social units that already have, that have the most capacity that will continue to get these funds. And again, these are basic points, but I think that they're important to reiterate. And I just want to thank my colleagues that were talking about their experiences, because I think there's nothing that's more enlightening or enlivening and more motivating, than hearing about what it's like on the ground, a non-abstracted version of these things we talk about, like managed retreat. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Alessandra.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and get my slides up. Great. So I'm just going to talk through very briefly the 3 of these sort of unavoidable points, continuing on what Beth shared, and I think really building on all of these examples that you've heard from Patty, from Chantel, from Annie, from Nathan. And the first of these is that retreat is portrayed as the only reasonable option for some communities, but not for others, without full consideration of possible alternatives. And that this in turn privileges the property rights of some above others. These narratives around retreat as being the only option seem to arise more in communities that are more remote, communities that have lower dollar value in infrastructure. We don't see such a dearth of alternative options in these communities as we do when we look at some urban areas, for example, that are at substantial risk from rising sea levels, hurricanes, and so on. Certainly there is a conversation about retreat in the longer term, but it's a little different, and there seem to often be more alternatives placed on the table. So I think we need to really ask who's being asked to bear the burden of adaptation, who's being asked to sort of be the trial run, who's being asked to go through this process. And we also see that the property rights of some and the uses by some seem to be privileged above those by others. So what is it that makes retreat the only option? Chantel talked about the cost to protect Ile-de-Jean-Charles in the past, right? Perhaps would have been less than it will now cost to have resettlement. And one of the reasons why resettlement was talked about was because the road would not be repaired. And yet Nathan showed some work on that same road so that it could be used for fishing. And so the uses of some seem to justify the expenditures, whereas the needs of communities don't always. And Patty also shared a map with the locations of levee systems and talked about the value judgments that come into these decisions both historically and in the present time, about where and how to invest resources. The second, and building upon that last point, adaptation strategies that don't take the historic drivers of risk into account, including policies that reduce adaptive capacity, are going to only perpetuate inequity. And I would suggest, again, that the history that was shared by Patty, by Chantel, by Nathan is very important in thinking about this point, because there's a certain narrative that arises, particularly in policy and practitioner circles, where community members are talked about as being just a little bit difficult or a little bit non-compliant. These idea that folks perhaps need to realize the risk they're in, need to go ahead and accept the need to retreat. And that narrative passes up a value judgment without looking at the context of both the creation of risk and the very active elimination of adaptive capacity in communities that has historically taken place and has created this situation. And so something like the benefit cost model, it may on the surface seem very rational, but it doesn't account for the reasons why there may have been a lack of infrastructure investment, a lack of maintenance, why communities are valued the way they're valued at a particular point in time. And yet it couches this in sort of a perception of neutrality that I think is very dangerous, conflating perhaps equality with equity. And finally, even when or if communities are granted funding for relocation, administrative procedures might still prove an insurmountable burden. Managing not just one grant program, but multiple is very difficult, even for the most well-resourced community with access to a lot of in-house and consultant expertise. The programs that we have at best can do bits and pieces of a larger resettlement project. We're often looking at having to separate out components that have to do with housing, with cultural preservation, with infrastructure, with restoration of the natural environment, and so on. Each of these programs having different requirements for management, for administration, different timelines, different match requirements. And that's a burden that is almost impossible to meet. And again, who is then framed as sort of being at fault when programs don't go as intended, or perhaps when really well-intentioned efforts still fail because the regulatory and legal structures don't actually allow for what it is that people need to be able to do. Thank you.
Thanks, Alessandra. And so we've been told that we are allowed to go a few minutes over for our session because we started late, but I just want to say that if anybody needs to get off and wants to move on to the next session, we understand that this part will be recorded and you can access it later. So now I'd like to invite Simon to come on and give us his presentation and maybe some concluding thoughts.
Thank you, Beth. Let me just put up my slides. Hello, everyone. So my presentation today will just sort of focus on the broader questions of how success is or has been framed in historical cases of buyouts. And I'm looking at specifically at one of the earliest cases of Weyiouanna to sort of reflect on how existing literature has somewhat constructed success, looking at what is included in the definitions of success or what is excluded. And I think more broadly, there's a lot we don't know about the extent to which relocation programs meet their objectives of reducing vulnerability, and indeed what success really should look like in reality. And we know that probably success itself can be highly debated, and it can be context specific. But I believe, or I feel like exploring how agencies and different actors have framed success can have significant implications, or can have significant implications on programmatic and social justice. So the way we understand success in the so-called cases of relocation more broadly can help to review the gaps between the theoretical and policy commitments, social justice, and the questions around equity and the like. So when you look at the two quotes I've put there, we seem to have different perspectives coming from the community experiences in federal agencies, and this in a way creates a gap and role and importance for research and reviews and explorations to understand what the so-called successful relocations really are and how they frame success. So when you focus on the case of Weyiouanna, in the you realize that existing literature seems to have used the early case of Weyiouanna in many cases, and the focus has been the removal of property, the number of properties that have been removed, rebuilding or relocating a village to the next available land, and building new residential areas, commercial properties, schools, churches, and other public offices. Seems to feature prominently in the existing literature, describing what success is, the building of new businesses, food and beverage structures, and most importantly, incorporation of sustainable technologies in the new structures that were built for the community. And also creation of open spaces. But when you look at the incorporation of sustainable technologies, we find that what is unclear is whether the incorporation of new technologies or green technologies is what the community was actually looking for. So the critical questions that emerge would be, what is success and how is success framed, and what do these framings take into account? And what is excluded in these definitions of success, and how do these framings really implicate forms of recovery or effective forms of recovery? But you find that based on this buyout process in Weyiouanna, the descriptions in the literature has pointed to the fact that Weyiouanna successfully utilized a buyout, or successfully applied and received funding, or managed to relocate to a different location, or successfully, relocated above the floodplain, and more broadly, FEMA, describing Weyiouanna as the mitigation best practice. But the picture sort of tends to get a bit complicated when you start exploring important but less frequently cited narratives about what went on there. And you find that in this case study, about 40% of the homeowners actually did not relocate. And you've got narratives that are coming, but not frequently cited, from the 26 homeowners that decided to rebuild. And a known number of people seems to have exited or left Weyiouanna after the floodplain. In some cases, allowing new entrants as homeowners in the new relocated area. And in a way, we see that the buyout, activation of a buyout, reshape the composition of the floodplain itself. And also the impacts on the business sector itself seems to have, be less, cited in this relocation case. And in some cases, you find that former business owners would describe relocation and the buyout process itself not to have been a good business decision. But also, Nathan was actually talking about the land use dynamics and the land grabs. That land grabbing, in a way, even if it invokes a narrative of force, there can also be existing or systematic policy and legal provisions that actually can reshape land access, land availability, and land utilization. And in Weyiouanna, you find that relocating to a new area, to a new lot of land, led to a 53% loss of the land. And you find that, community members now are complaining or have cited smaller houses and, smaller yards as one of the outcomes for relocating and losing about 320 acres of land. There are also narratives that point to disruptions to social networks that you don't find in the dominant descriptions of the case itself. A lost sense of communities. You find that with a lot of resistance for the lot selection, we had new entrants producing new neighbors. And you find also that there seems to be little emphasis on the intangible connections to the previous community. And I like the point that Anne mentioned earlier on, that sometimes these are voices that need to be heard and not be treated as maybe an item that has to be moved from one point of location to the other. So critical voices seem to be missing. And when you look at this, the picture seems to be, get a little bit complicated. But these experiences necessitate, in my view, a focus on human systems themselves and how these systems place people in relation to each other and to the environment. And both are rooted in the historical experiences. Lowering risks to people is very important, as well as lowering risks to property. But there seems to be somewhat of a focus on removal of property, as Beth had actually highlighted earlier on. So from my angle, I think broadening our framing of success would be very important in creating more effective forms of recovery for disaster-affected communities and people. Thank you. I'll leave it there, Beth.
Thank you, Simon. And so just to conclude this, this session, I'll ask one question, and particularly I think I'll direct this question to Annie, Chantal, and Patty, which is a question that came from the audience, and it's this. What would climate justice look like for you and your communities? Does anybody want to just talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll just say real quickly that, first of all, we know that underserved communities and Native American communities serve disproportionately impacted by climate impacts and have contributed least to those impacts. And I think that we in the US don't recognize that. And when I say that, I mean policymakers, with regards to recognizing harms and then having some accountability to address those harms. So I think that we need to do that. We also, in dealing with climate issues and climate justice issues, we need to make sure that the tribal communities and other communities affected have a voice, and that's already been discussed here, because we have an opportunity to change the narrative, to start working with communities to, try to address the harm and future of our communities before it's too late. I will note that some tribes in Louisiana and Arizona filed a complaint with the United Nations to address some of these issues because we see them as human rights violations. And so hopefully, I don't know if everyone can see it, I just posted it, but hopefully that can be shared with the audience.
This is Chantel. I agree. I think to that point, it's not just a seat at the table, but also an actual voice. So we had a seat at the table in our resettlement, but we clearly did not have a voice to effectively change what happened. So I really think that listening and allowing us to help our voice to help dictate the future could go a long way.
Okay, so I think we'll end there. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning, and we hope to continue these conversations going forward.